All right, we're going to look at some common disorders, and we'll start with growth hormone. Now, as mentioned, I cannot possibly cover every single endocrine disorder that we have, that humans have. And there are certainly some other ones that are very interesting. And if you're curious about this, it's certainly within your power to look up other videos on YouTube or to read about these other endocrine disorders online. I will start with endocrine disorders that affect growth hormone. Okay. Growth hormone can be hypersecreted. So this would be the pituitary. Remember, pituitary is the one that produces the growth hormone. And so if the pituitary has a growth hormone secreting tumor, or is for other reasons a little overzealous in how it secretes growth hormone, it can cause some difficulties for homeostasis is lost, and it can cause some difficulties. If this secretion, this hypersecretion, occurs during childhood, what happens is that the child grows quite large, and we would call this gigantism. Might sound like a great thing to be very tall, but extremely tall individuals also tend to have difficulty with their joints and their legs and with their heart. And so these individuals frequently will die relatively early in life because their bodies cannot sustain and support the weight that is generated by excess growth. If growth hormone continues to be elevated once the growth plates have fused and the child has gone through puberty and has reached adulthood, then at that point, instead of growing taller, the individuals begin to experience growth in other ways. The joints of their hands will get thicker, their fingers will get longer, their hands will get larger, their feet will get larger. Their nose can grow larger, their jawbone gets thicker, and they suffer from arthritis and pain because of the deformed joints that they have. If their smile, their teeth spread apart as their jaw enlarges. And it's a very difficult disorder to deal with, very uncomfortable, very painful. If you look at this individual here, you can actually see the progression of this condition, and we call this condition acromegaly. And you can see somebody who looks like a very nice young man, normal features, and then as he changes, you can notice, his forehead is broadening, his nose has gotten a little bigger, his jaw, right, seems to have gotten thicker. And then again, as he continues to age, you can now see, even more of that growth with the jaw getting larger, more square, as you can see that. The cheekbones kind of pressing outward. We don't see his hands and feet, but his hands and feet would become larger, and the joints would become knobby, and so forth. And so people can have, so children that have excess growth hormone can suffer from gigantism. And if that continues, they can also have acromegaly. A famous person who had both would be Andre the Giant. He was a very tall man. He was a very large man. And he did have that thickened face. Oh, the tongue will continue to grow. And so if you watched Andre the Giant and the Princess Bride, kind of a cult classic, his speech was thicker, sounded like he was talking with his mouth full, and it's because his tongue would have been enlarged as well. And it's very common for people with these conditions to die of heart failure because the heart has difficulty supplying this enlarged body and will sometimes give out in fatigue. Not everybody with acromegalia has gigantism, though. Acromeglia can occur on its own due to a tumor that spontaneously forms, perhaps on the pituitary. The flip side of that is what we have hyposecretion of growth hormone. And some types of hyposecretion of growth hormone can cause dwarfism. Now, if we're dealing with only a disorder in the growth hormone, we tend to get what's called a proportionate dwarfism. Now, somebody who suffers from this condition doesn't want to be called a dwarf, so don't, that's not the language you would use, but the condition itself would be called disproportionate dwarfism, and it's due to slow muscle growth, slow bones. Overall, body proportions tend to stay consistent, and so they really just look like small people with normally proportioned heads and arms and legs. Sometimes, depending on the nature and of this growth hormone deficiency, as well as other growth factors. Recall that there's several growth factors. So if other growth factors play into this, we also might have cognitive delays if brain development is affected. But not always. We can have underdeveloped systems such as the respiratory system and cardiovascular system, which can lead to shortened lives for those who have these disorders. And in some cases, bone development would just not be adequate. We would end up with the bone not being able to support the weight of an individual, and so it's not uncommon for individuals with dwarfism to end up in wheelchairs. Then you have disproportionate dwarfism, which tends to be more genetic disorder as opposed to damage to the pituitary. And these genetic disorders can actually cause, there's a number of different types of genetic dwarfism that cause disproportionate development. So these individuals will often have an enlarged head, a very small torso, and perhaps a little bit longer legs, or a normal torso and very small legs. It varies by person to person and condition to condition, and some of them it'll affect the spine, so they will be hunched over, and that compresses their respiratory system and makes it difficult for them to breathe. And so those are some conditions that occur, and in each of those cases we would have problems with the amount of growth hormone that exists during childhood. Now, sometimes adults can spontaneously develop hyposecretion of growth hormone, and typically they don't feel well. They're going to have some problems with blood glucose levels, because recall that growth hormone is glucose sparing. They're going to have issues with low energy, low muscle tone, and perhaps a loss of density within their bones. And so they can suffer, but it's not as extreme as a situation as when it occurs during childhood.